Hi grade 9s. I'm hoping that after our quite lengthy video on trinomials and then quite a lot of practicing on your own, I've hoped that you've asked a lot of questions along the way. So I'm hoping that you're feeling a little bit more complicated with trinomials, because now we're staying with the same type, but we're moving on to slightly more complex. Now they don't really get too much more complicated. The hard work is really done. But you would have noticed in the previous video that there was never a highest common factor. Whereas what I'm going to do now is introduce what happens if there was a highest common factor before you even start the trinomial. So don't forget to write down all our notes, write down the examples and hit pause whenever you need time to rewatch something or write down the notes. So if we look at example 1, it says factorize, and we often forget and make our lives very difficult. The first thing you must always check for is the highest common factor. So in this case, unlike the previous video, each of those terms are divisible by 3. So I'm going to take out a highest common factor of 3, so that'll be 3x squared, then minus 7, because 7 times 3 is 21, and minus 8, because 3 times 8 is 24. Once we've done our highest common factor, we need to say to ourselves, do we have a dots? Or do we have a trinomial? Or do we have nothing? Is that it? Was there only a highest common factor and that's it? Now, you'll be able to tell from the mark allocation, because a highest common factor question is 1 mark, sometimes 2 if it was complicated. So you'll be able to pretty easily tell whether you should be going on. The moment it's a 3 or 4 mark question, there's no way that that one line would be 3 or 4 marks. So I can immediately look at this bracket and say, hang on, that's a trinomial, because it has 3 terms and it has the right pattern. There's an x squared term, then an x term, then a constant. So now that I know it's a trinomial, I start with my 5 steps. My first step is every trinomial comes from a binomial times a binomial. Now before I move on, I mustn't forget my 3 doesn't just disappear, it stays there. Step number 2. Step number 2 is the obvious step. Where did x squared come from? It must have come from x times x. Step number 3. How could I have multiplied together to give me 8? So my options would be 1 times 8, or the only other option would be 2 times 4. My next step is to look at my signs. Don't forget, we always look at our constants to get a hint about our signs. Our signs need to multiply together to give me a negative. So my signs clearly need to be different. So one's going to be a plus, although it doesn't matter which order, and then one's going to be a minus. Now it does matter who gets the minus and who gets the plus. So now I need to say to myself, how am I going to add together to get minus 7 x's? My middle terms are all going to be x's, and I need minus 7. Now I need different signs. Now if I look at my 2 and 4, I immediately think that's never going to work. Because if my signs were having to be different, 4 take away 2 would be 2. So I definitely think immediately that 1 and 8 are the way to go, because those can definitely get me 7. Now I need minus 7 and I need different signs. So I think the 8 needs the negative and the 1 needs the positive, because minus 8 plus 1 will get me minus 7. Don't forget that you can multiply out your binomial times a binomial and check. So that would be a 3 to 4 mark question. And hopefully your trinomials are getting easier and easier for you. Okay, let's have a look at B. Question B. First of all, as we've said so far, first thing I need to check for is a highest common factor. So if I just started this question, I would say, right, negative 4, 4, and negative 48, all divisible by 4. Do I take out a positive or do I take out a negative? Now something I've said before is we always try and take out a negative if the first term is a negative. So I would be tempted to take out a negative here, which would leave me with a, because negative 4 times a is negative 4a, minus a squared, because the negative times the negative will give me the positive, and then plus 12. Right, so now that I've done that, I'd look at my mark allocation, and if it's 3 or 4 marks, and even if it wasn't, and I just wanted to check, do I have a dots or do I have a trinomial? Now if I have a look at this bracket is 3 terms, which means my only option is a trinomial. Does it have the right pattern? the pattern needs to be a squared, and then a, and then the constant. Now, this looks tempting, as in there's an a squared, there's an a, and there's my constant, but it's the wrong order. Now, there's nothing wrong with changing the order, so I can put my minus a squared first, then my a, and then my plus 12. Now, this leaves me with a problem, because I never, ever, ever want to factorize with a negative coefficient of my squared term in a trinomial, because it throws off all my signs. It's not impossible, it's just very, very annoying. And so what I should have realized from the start is that this does look like a trinomial. There's an a squared term, there's an a term, and there's a constant. So from the start, I would avoid taking this out. I would first change my order, because we like to write, I don't know if you remember grade 8, but we always used to talk about writing an expression in descending powers of x. And it seemed quite weird in grade 8, because why would we care? This is exactly why we cared. Descending powers of x, or in this case a, means the highest exponent to the least exponent, simply because that helps us to factorize. So now I can see that actually it makes sense to take out 4 as the highest common factor, so that a squared is positive, and it's much easier to factorize. So absolutely check out your highest common factor, but first maybe rearrange things to always put it in descending powers of a. Now this is a trinomial, and the first step in a trinomial is to realize that it comes from a binomial times a binomial. Again, my 4 can't disappear, it's got to stay there. My second step is the obvious. How could I multiply together to give me a squared? So that'll be a times a. My third step, don't forget we skip the middle term and we go to the constant. Now we've done a lot of practicing with 12, so our options are 12 and 1, 6 and 2, or 3 and 4. So on to our next step. Our next step is our signs. Now I need to multiply together to give me negative 12, so I know my signs are different. So I'm not too sure where the positive and negative must go, but I can just pop them in, because order doesn't matter. So finally, how do I add together to get my middle term, which is minus 1a? Well, 12 and 1 are definitely out. 6 and 2 even look dodgy, and I've practiced this before. 3 and 4 can get me 1. Now I need negative 1, so I want minus 4 plus 3. So minus 4 plus 3. Don't forget to multiply out in a test or exam. You can do it on your question paper just to check whether you got this right. Now I want to write myself a little note here about this highest common factor. Highest common factor, always aim for a positive squared term. So always aim for a positive a squared term, or it could be x squared, but in this case it was a squared. So in this case, rearrange to get the right order. So rearrange to get the correct order, and I say correct, there's no such thing as correct order, so I'm putting in inverted commas, it's just the easier order. So rearrange to get the correct order before your highest common factor, because otherwise you don't know whether to take out a negative or a positive. Right, so that's B. Question C, I'm playing on this exact idea, because if you'll notice here, this says negative a squared plus 9a minus 8. So that looks perfectly like a trinomial. The first thing I would check for is the highest common factor. Now there isn't really a highest common factor because nothing goes into a squared and 9a and 8. However, exactly what I've just said, we never want a negative a squared. So to avoid this negative a squared, what we're going to do is we're going to take out a highest common factor of negative 1. Now 1 goes into everything, and so here negative 1 actually also goes into everything because it just changes the sign. So I wouldn't normally think of 1 as a common factor, but I would think of negative 1 as a common factor, simply so that I can get a positive a squared in the bracket. Now you'll notice what happens is all the signs end up changing, because a negative times a negative will give me a positive, and a negative times a positive will give me a negative. So all I've done there is to avoid a negative a squared term. I've taken out a common factor of -1. Now this is a wonderfully factorizable trinomial, and every trinomial, step 1, comes from a binomial times a binomial. So my -1 stays around as a common factor. Step number 2, how do I get a squared? Would come from a times a. Step number 3, what are my factors that I'm going to multiply together to give me 8? So we've also tried 8 before, so this is 8 and 1. And you'll notice you start repeating trinomials. There's only a certain number of trinomials, so you get very used to them. So 8 and 1 and 4 and 2. What are my options for my signs? Well, remember, don't forget we look at the constant to get a hint about the signs. My sign is a positive 8, so I need the same signs. So either I need a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative. Now I can tell which one by looking at the middle term. I want my like terms to add together to give me a negative, so I need both my like terms to be negative. So finally I say to myself, right, I need my like terms in the middle to add to get minus 9a. Now the minus is taken care of, so the question is, how do I get 9? And so immediately I think 8 and 1. And it doesn't matter where I put the 8 and 1, because they're both negative, so it doesn't matter. Again, you can multiply out and check if you're right. Now, if you factorized without doing the negative as a highest common factor, it doesn't mean you can't do it. You absolutely can. Your answer would look different, but it would multiply out to give you the original question. So don't worry if your answer doesn't look exactly like this. Multiply out to check. Right, on to question D. Highest common factor. Now, the moment I look at this, I see negative to start with, so I say to myself, is it in the right order? And I think the order is correct, because look, it's a squared, then a, then the number. And so I think we can proceed. Now, remember, with a highest common factor, you want a positive a squared in the bracket. So I'm going to take out -2 as a highest common factor. So -2 times positive 11 will give me minus 22, and -2 times positive 10 will give me 20. Next, I'm going to say to myself, do I have a dots or a trinomial? It's definitely a trinomial because there's 3 terms. And don't forget, our first step is every trinomial comes from a binomial times a binomial. So immediately I'm going to write bracket. Don't forget to bring down your -2 as your highest common factor. So step number 2. How do you get your a squared? I must get it from a times a. Step number 3. What are my options for 10? Now, as you start getting better and better at this, you start looking at the 10 and then flicking your eye across to the middle term and seeing the 11, and immediately I think 10 and 1. So if you are struggling, I would definitely in an exam write them down, 10 and 1 and 5 and 2. But if I've just glanced over to that middle term, there's no ways 5 and 2 are going to add together to give me 11. So fourth step is my signs. My constant is positive, so my signs need to be the same. They either both have to be positive or both have to be negative. If I look at my middle term, they both have to be positive, because I need my like terms to add together to give me positive 11. And so lastly, how do I get positive 11? I've already discussed with you the fact that I think I need 10 and 1, because 10 and 1 will add to 11. So you can start skipping steps if you can glance over and see an obvious answer. It's you don't actually have to look at all the options. Just don't forget to multiply it in your head and check. Okay, on to question E. Now this doesn't look like a trinomial at all, and it might not be, because I have A's and B's, and that's really weird for me. So my first thing I check for is my highest common factor. So if I look at my numbers, 5, 40, and 45. Okay, 5 is definitely common. Okay, a squared b, ab, and b. Well, I was thinking that a would be common, but my last term has no a's, but every term has a b. So now I say to myself, 5b times a squared would give me 5a squared b. 5b times minus 8a will give me minus 40ab. and 5 times minus 9 would give me minus 45b. So now, don't forget, if you ever left with a bracket, do I have a dots or a trinomial? And here I have a trinomial, because this has 3 terms and it is in the right order with the right pattern. So my first step with a trinomial is that every trinomial comes from a binomial times a binomial. I mustn't forget my 5b. Right, second step. Where does my a squared come from? My a squared comes from a times a. So that's my second step. Third step. How could I possibly get 9? My options would be 9 and 1 or 3 and 3. Now if I just again glance over to the middle term of minus 8, I'm already thinking chances are it's going to be 9 and 1. Fourth step is if I have a look at my signs, my negative 9 tells me my signs need to be different. So I don't know who's going to get the plus and who's going to get the minus, but they are different. And so finally I say to myself, how am I going to get minus 8? Definitely 9 and 1, and it's minus 8. So I think the 9 must be a minus and the 1 must be a plus. Great. Hopefully this is getting better and better. Right, on to question F. First step, highest common factor. I'm going to take out a 3, and an x, because all of them have at least one x. The 18 only has one x, and so once I've taken out one x, that's all I can take out. So now I'm left with x squared minus 7x plus 6. Just multiply that out and check. I've started doing my highest common factors fairly fast. Hopefully you're also at that same point. Then I say to myself, this is a trinomial. Every trinomial comes from a binomial times a binomial. And I'm going to bring down my 3x. My second step is what is obvious. So this is my second step, is that x times x will give me x squared. My third step is how do I get 6? We've done quite a lot of 6s. 6 can be 6 and 1 or 2 and 3. Now again, if I just glance that middle step, that middle term, the middle term is minus 7. I'm definitely thinking 6 and 1. If I look at my signs have to be the same. So either positive or negative and negative, because my constant is a positive. But my middle term is negative. So I need them both to be negative, so my like terms will add together to give me minus 7. And I've already kind of answered this part. I'm pretty sure that the only way to get minus 7x would be using 6 and 1. So minus 6 minus 1 will give me minus 7. Great, so hopefully this extra step of highest common factor isn't actually throwing us too much at all. The thing is, we mustn't forget once we've done a highest common factor to check for something more. Okay, 2 more examples. Let's look at G. Question G, I'm thinking highest common factor, but there's nothing. And there's 3 terms, and it fits the right pattern. So I'm immediately thinking a trinomial, so binomial times binomial. First step. Second step, how do I get x squared? X times x. Third step, how do I get 5? Well, there's only one option. It's 5 and 1, so I can actually put it in immediately. There's not multiple options. What do my signs have to be? My signs have to be different signs. So I need a plus and a minus. So the question is, who's going to get the plus and who's going to get the minus? I need plus 4. So I think I need positive 5, take away 1. So that was actually a fairly easy question, which means you might wonder, why is it in the more complex thing? Now, why it's in the more complex lesson is because I'm trying to lead you to question H. Now, question H, I would say to myself, is there a highest common factor? Now, immediately I don't see a highest common factor because this has got x squared, this is xy, and that's no x's, it's only y squared. So I don't see an x or a y that's common. So I have no highest common factor. But this to me is not a trinomial, because yes, this is an x squared term, and yes, this is an x term, but why is there a y there? And why is there a y squared? So If we want to be really, really mean, we do this type of question. It is still a trinomial, and you start to get really used to this pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore the y, and I'm going to ignore the y squared. If those weren't there, you'll notice that these are exactly the same question. So if the y's weren't there, I would argue that this would be exactly the same as above, x times x, 5 times 1 plus 5, take away 1. Now let me just quickly make this a little bit more spacious. Okay, so that would multiply together to give me x squared plus 4x minus 5. Now, where do these y's come in? How does this y factor into these two brackets? First of all, how would you possibly have the middle terms being xy terms? And how would you have the constant not being a constant but being a y squared? Well, these two will multiply together to give you minus 5. Now, I don't need minus 5, I need minus 5 y squared. So if I put a y there and a y there, I'm hoping that you would agree that 5y times minus 1y would get me the y squared I need. Now, if I put a y in each of those positions, have a look what happens to the middle term. That is now minus 1 xy, and this is now plus 5 xy, which makes my middle term plus 4 xy. So this is a fairly complex trinomial. If you notice you have a squared and then the letter and then a number, but you also have another letter. If you have the y there and there's the y squared, don't be confused. This is actually a trinomial, and what I would actually do in an exam is I would shade that out, and I would say, right, let's pretend those aren't there. Then factorize without that, and then go and put in my purple y's back in. Simply because it's very easy to do without the y's, and then you just pop them in. Now you'll know this pattern because you'll notice that this last term has to be a y squared term, because you would have to have y times y, and the middle term has to be the mixture. So it is a fairly complicated one, but it does crop up every now and again. It's not very common, but you do start to get used to it. Right, so that's the end of complex trinomials. Hopefully they weren't too difficult. We're just going to try a couple of them. It's exercise 18.11. We're going to try the left-hand column. Then you can mark it, and don't forget to ask questions whenever you're unsure. Trinomials can be tricky at first, and it's only through practicing and struggling and asking questions that you'll get better. Okay, well done.